Like, to separate these things out and to recognize distinct entities here. This is a human, it requires like some sort of conscious differentiation to create these concepts. These concepts don't exist. You can't see sex anywhere, right? There is no way to see sex in the same way that you can't see a chair. You've got like a collection or organization of matter, and you might be able to describe like its constituent elements, but you can't see that particular thing, because that particular thing it's a human organization of the concept.
After watching that clip, some of you may be thinking to yourself,
oh my God, this is like, sometimes people are so smart, they're stupid.
Now, as much as I love watching Destiny flail around as he tries to explain this, the truth is he's onto something. We don't see objects, and Jordan Peterson is more aware of this than anyone.
Because like when you look out the world, you just see, well, look, there's objects out there. And by the way, you don't see objects. When you look at the world, you just see it, and you think, well, seeing is easy because there the things are, and all you have to do is turn your head and they appear. And that's just so wrong that it's almost impossible to overstate.
Now, whether Destiny realizes it or not, this idea is so disgustingly important. It's the philosophical issue that lies at the root of, without exception, every single important disagreement between the left and the right. Let's start with a very well-known and mainstream manifestation of this disagreement. The debate over gender ideology and the answer to the question, what is a woman?
The question of what is a woman is just a retard's way of trying to get a gotcha because they're either too intellectually lazy to explore, like trans topics, or they're genuinely too retarded to understand how sophisticated or complicated language is. Any singular word is truly going to be pretty difficult to define when you're talking about the difference between like universal categories of things versus like particular things themselves. Just definitionally, these are incredibly difficult things to pin down.
Did you catch it? Listen to that last part again.
Any singular word is truly going to be pretty difficult to define when you're talking about the difference between like universal categories of things versus like particular things themselves.
Universals versus particulars. If there is one thing you take away from this video, it is understanding this fundamental philosophical dichotomy, and more importantly, how it structures the ongoing civil war between the left, who can be described as philosophical nominalists, and the right, who can be described as philosophical realists.
So the way that Dugin presents it in the book is that we have a medieval dispute among theologians and philosophers over the ontological status of universals. So if I say, for example, that here's a horse, there's a horse, okay, 3 horses. Now, only the particular horse exists, or does the category of horse also exist? Does the general category or the general grouping, the species or whatever the case is, the idea of the horse, does that also exist? So is a debate over the existence of universals. Are only particulars real, or are universals also real? And the idea here is that nominalism came down on the side that only particulars are real, that universals are a function not of what exists, but of what we say. So nominalism suggests that universalism is a function just of the act of naming, in effect. That the only reality is the individual.
The nominalist philosophy, which is the philosophy that characterizes the left, claims that universal categories don't exist, only individuals and particulars. In other words, there is no objective reality to the concept or category of woman. There are only individuals who nominally identify with the word woman.
Answer you should be able to provide is what exactly is a woman?
Well, for me, it's actually a really simple answer, and that's a person who identifies as a woman.
But what are they identifying as?
As a woman.
But what is that?
As a woman.
Do you know what a circular definition is?
I do.
On the right, people who adopt a philosophical realist position would argue that there is an objective definition of woman and would put forward something like adult human female. Now, as you'll see by the end of this video, both of these sides are only partially correct, and the better perspective is the enlightened centrist one that people like pre-Coma, pre-Daily Wire Jordan Peterson have adopted. Postmodernists like Judith Butler, Michel Foucault, or Philosophy Tube occupy the extreme nominalist position, while religious fundamentalists like Muhammad Hijab or friend of the channel Andrew Wilson occupy the extreme realist position. Destiny, at least in this clip, seems to plant his flag firmly in the nominalist camp.
Sex for mammals exists outside of human understanding, though. No, it doesn't. That's not true. Sex is a category of things. No, there might be underlying facts about underlying matter or whatever, where animals might have particular things and go about in particular ways and create babies and all of that. But the categories of sex, these categorical things, are ways that humans organize things on the planet. It's our way of like making sense of the world. These universal categories don't exist outside of human understanding.
Like I said, there is some truth in this position, but if you take it to its logical conclusion, you end up making arguments like this.
But let's just use the example of water. Maybe we could agree that water is H2O. That was true even before we knew about chemistry.
This
it was
isn't
H2O.
true.
I'm sorry?
This isn't true.
That water has not always been H2O?
Yeah, all you have to do is cross the Mexican border. And over there, it's aqua. That's H2O, not water.
Aqua means water. Aqua is water.
It's a different term.
Actually, it's agua. It's not aqua, right?
And we're referring to terms and definitions here.
No, I'm referring to water, the stuff that fills lakes and rivers.
The
I'm
stuff
not
that
talking
fills
about the word one.
many things fill lakes and rivers.
Okay.
Again, the philosophical nominalists on the left do have a point. Objective universal categories are hard to nail down, especially when it's very easy to identify exceptions. Philosophical realists will claim that the definition of woman is adult human female, but then they will struggle to stay consistent with this belief when dealing with edge cases.
Transgender woman from Orange is the New Black.
I never watched that show.
I've never watched that show either, but she's on the cover of Time magazine.
Oh.
Or he's on the cover of Time magazine.
Let's also put a picture of her by the mantle. Keep the kids away from the fire.
Yeah.
Him. Shoot. Whatever. Z. I don't know. You can admonish me off the bat because I can't keep this straight.
Wait, but why can't he keep it straight? It should be incredibly obvious, right? Because he and she literally just mean chromosomes, right? You're never mixing those up, right? It should be really easy, no?
But these slip-ups aside, here's the inevitable problem that the left-wing nominalists face. If there are no objective universals, then our most basic categories that society depends on, like marriage or the nuclear family, are liable to be deconstructed into pure subjectivity.
When we start breaking down these basic central institutions, like the institution of the family and of marriage, that's where the harm comes from.
We are rattling to the core heteronormative family structures. What they have to lose is the belief in their supremacy, their immutability, their necessity, their universality, and that is a big loss for them. But they're going to have to grieve that loss. And that's what we're telling them. Grieve that loss and enter into a better world with the rest of us.
And the more that people believe, the more that we build a society where it's believed that marriage is objectively meaningless, right? It's entirely subjective. It's just about making you feel better. The more that we build a society like that, I think that's where the harm comes in, the worse it is.
Reasonable people can disagree about the definition of marriage, but only the most ideologically possessed left-wing postmodern philosophical nominalists would argue that dissolving the nuclear family would produce better outcomes for children and society more broadly. It's statements like these that drive most of the justified reactionary sentiment on the right. And speaking of right-wing reactionaries, Destiny seems fully aware of the opposition to his ostensibly nominalist beliefs.
These are literally socially created concepts by humans. Language doesn't exist and categories don't exist outside of human. Well, unless you think that there's a God that exists that creates categories of things. But then that's a whole other religious epistemic argument or whatever.
Okay, so how do you determine that anything is morally right or wrong?
I do it from divine command. You do it from preference. I'm
no, you
where
do it
you're
from
at.
divine command. What does that mean? Explain that.
So this means that I follow Christian ethics. I use transcendental categories inside of philosophy to create justifications for the values which come from God's laws. That's what I do.
That's a lot of words to not say anything.
So it sounds like there's some sort of biblical scholarship that there are things like he believes in like the 10 Commandments, and that from these 10 Commandments and from your reading of Scripture and from the teachings of, I guess, whatever religious denomination he is a part of, that from there you can derive your moral oughts, whatever ethical principles that you ought to follow that are essentially coming from God, and then they're expressed through, I guess, like Scripture or priestly teachings or whatever else.
This is a decent summary of the philosophical bedrock underneath right-wing ideologies like Christian nationalism. Philosophical realism posits that universal categories exist and are divinely inspired. God created man and woman in his image, therefore men and women are fundamentally objective and divinely inspired categories. God commanded men and women to get married, thus marriage is a objective, divinely inspired category. The problem with philosophical realism is fairly obvious. Even if objective categories did exist and were defined in a foundational religious text, like the Bible or the Quran, there is no way to interpret, or in theological terms, exegete these foundational religious texts without applying a human, i.e. subjective, level of interpretation.
That's really not the claim that religious fundamentalists make. The claim they make is worse than that, because they claim that the Quran, say, or the Bible for that matter, is the literal word of God. But more than that, they claim that their understanding of that word is correct, which means they conflate two things. Like, because you could imagine a situation where you had a book, and I'm not saying this is the case, it's an imaginative exercise, where you had a book that had all the answers, that was extraordinarily complicated. And so that when you read it, it wouldn't be obvious that you understood it, or perhaps it wouldn't be obvious that you didn't understand it either, but you're not going to be able to, you can't get an uninterpreted version of the book. And so the fundamentalist claim is far worse. It's that not only is there an absolute reality, truth, embedded in the book, but that their particular take on that absolute reality is the absolute take on that book.
So if the right-wing realists can't pin down objective truth, and the left-wing nominalists don't believe in universal objective truth to begin with, who can we turn to for answers?
Unironically, I don't even know if he would stand by his answer because he's so unhinged now. Jordan Peterson actually gave the best answer on that documentary for What is a Woman. If you're not retarded, it's actually an insightfully correct answer, but I don't even know if Peterson knew how insightful or correct it was.
We've been journeying across the country asking people this question, and almost nobody can answer it.
What is a woman?
What is a woman?
Marry one and find out.
That's technically, the use case is the correct answer. Peterson's answer is completely correct. Now, I don't know if he was saying that with any level of linguistic insight or any like philosophical understanding of what he's saying there about language. But that is how we discover what words are, what language means, and how things are. It's as you use concepts and become familiar with them, meaning you have some sort of experience with them. This is how we develop language and vocabulary and communicate from person to person. That is what it is. So if you want to know what a particular thing is, truly the only way to know what that thing is to go out and experience it.
Now, putting aside Destiny's proclivity to sound like an insecure teenage girl.
Now, I don't know if he was saying that with any level of linguistic insight.
His broader point about Peterson's philosophy is correct. Peterson is operating from a philosophical framework that I and many others would regard as the best philosophical framework. It's called pragmatism, and I will once again lean on my champion spotlights to explain. As an epistemological pragmatist, Jordan Peterson wields fundamental concepts like truth and God in ways that can be confusing.
I think that fundamentalists and atheistic scientists have the same problem. The fundamentalists make the proposition that biblical stories are literal representations of the truth. And that might be true depending on what you mean by literal. But what they mean by literal, or what they attempt to make literal mean, is that they're in the same category as scientific facts. Because they don't have the idea that there are different ways of approaching truth and that truths can serve different purposes. They don't have a sense that your definition of truth is actually something like a tool rather than an ontological statement about the reality of the world.
But Jordan, for example, knows like religious texts better, right? And he understands pragmatism. That's a philosophy I fully agree with. So like he understands that truth is like a deeper multidimensional word than correspondence to like facts, right? Or even honesty, just like blurting out what you think, right? Truth is a deeper thing. Like when Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life," he's talking more about like the arete, like you know what I mean? Like the good, like almost like the pious, right?
Yeah.
Like the way to walk that works, right?
They might be predicated on pragmatic truths rather than objective truths. Pragmatic truths are truths that have functional utility. You know, they believe that your knowledge was a tool to advance being in the world, let's say, survival in the world, and that you justified your knowledge not because you had final knowledge of anything, but because your tools were good enough to obtain the end that you were aiming at. That was the validation process. If your theory was good enough to get you to where you were aiming, then it was true enough. And the pragmatists believed that that was the best that you could do with truth.
That is how we discover what words are, what language means, and how things are. It's as you use concepts and become familiar with them, meaning you have some sort of experience with them. This is how we develop language and vocabulary and communicate from person to person.
Truth is not an object that exists independent of human consciousness, nor is it subjective to the point of infinite malleability and deconstruction. Truth is a transjective tool, and the purpose or usefulness or meaning of that tool exists in between the objective world of facts and objects and the subjective world of motivation and experience.
Meaning is like the graspability. Remember I talked about optimal grip? It's like the graspability of that cup. Is that in me? No. Is it in the cup? No, because the fly can't grasp it. Well, graspability is in my hand. Well, I can't grasp Africa. No. There is a real relation, fittedness, between me and this cup. Same thing with the adaptivity of an organism. Is the adaptivity of a great white shark in the great white shark? Drop it in the Sahara, dies. Meaning isn't in me. I think that's romantic bullshit. And it isn't in the universe. It is a proper relationship. I've coined the phrase transjective. It is the binding relationship between the subjective and the objective.
The usefulness of a key is not a property of the key itself, but a transjective interaction between the key and a given lock. The infectiousness of a virus is not a property of the virus itself, but a transjective interaction between the shape of the spike protein and the receptors it binds to. So when Destiny says you can't see a chair, he is correctly pointing out that we do not see objective universal categories that exist independent of human beings. Instead, we see a landscape of tools and obstacles, the meaning of which is a transjective property that emerges from the interaction between the objective facts and the goals and motivations of the individual perceiving them. To put it poetically, one man's trash is another man's treasure.
The classic scientific idea is something like you perceive a universe of facts and derive conclusions and act. It's like, no, you don't. You perceive a landscape of pre-categorized relevance that's dependent on your ethic. Jesus, it's so peculiar that.
This is a very different way of looking at the world than a scientist or a computer might. Peterson actually gives a great example. Imagine you get an envelope with some important news in it. Scientifically, objectively, the envelope is a rectangle of paper and it has ink molecules printed on it, but that's not how you experience it. This envelope contains your past, your future, your test results, maybe the rest of your life. You experience it not just as an object, but as something with values and meaning.
Now look, let's be honest here. This shit is complicated. And if you've made it this far in the video and you're still confused because you're like, we see objects. I don't get how we don't see objects. That's fine. There's two things you should take away from this video. Number one, Destiny is probably autistic, which means he's very good at curating and applying lots of individual facts. But if he's not going to shore up his underlying metaphysics and philosophy, he's not going to be able to grasp at the important patterns that emerge from those facts. The other key takeaway is that truth is not just some subjective phenomenon based on language games, and it's not this purely objective phenomenon that only religious fundamentalists have access to. If you want to know what's true, the best thing you can do is just accept everything I say uncritically. Also, when CJ the X releases his 5-hour video on Jordan Peterson, you should watch that too. Until then, as always, good luck and Godspeed.